The first snow had come down like sifted flour, soft against the raw edges of the prairie. It clung to fence posts and roof shingles, quieting the world until even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Ruth Callahan stood on her porch with her baby pressed close against her chest. Daniel's cheeks were red from the cold, his small fists tucked into the folds of her shawl. She rocked him gently, though her own body felt stiff with weariness. From the ridge beyond the timberline, a rider appeared, broad-shouldered, slow-moving, his shape blurred by the drifting flakes. Jonas McGraw. The people in town said he lived closer to beasts than men, that he spent too many seasons in the mountains to ever fit among decent folk again. But Ruth did not have the luxury of listening to town gossip. Her husband was gone, claimed by the mines that swallowed so many men without apology, and the farm creaked beneath her thinning hands. Winter had come with its demands: wood to be chopped, fences mended, animals fed, roofs patched. Alone, with Daniel scarcely 1 year old, she would not last the season. So she hired Jonas. She watched him dismount, snow crunching under his boots. His coat was heavy, fur-lined, smelling of pine smoke and distance. He nodded once, the brim of his hat shadowing his face. Not a word wasted, not a glance that lingered too long. "Ma'am," he said, voice like gravel rubbed between palms. And that was all. Ruth's days began before the pale light touched the horizon. She would stoke the stove, cradle Daniel as he fussed for warmth, and move carefully about the kitchen, her skirts whispering over worn boards. Outside, she heard the steady rhythm of Jonas's axe striking wood. The sound carried through the morning fog, each strike sure and even, like the beat of a heart that refused to falter. She had expected him to take shortcuts as hired hands sometimes did, but Jonas worked with a quiet exactness. He did not pile the wood loosely by the shed. He stacked it neat, higher than she had asked, each log placed as if it mattered to him that the structure should stand strong. When she brought him bread at noon, he removed his hat in silence and nodded his thanks. Daniel cried often in those first days, restless with teething and the chill that crept under the doorframe. Ruth paced the cabin, whispering prayers that he would quiet. One evening, when her arms had grown weak and her patience thinner, she found Jonas standing in the doorway. His hands were rough and scarred, but when he reached for the child, it was with a gentleness that startled her. Daniel's cries stilled the moment Jonas held him. The baby's small fingers clutched the coarse weave of Jonas's shirt, and his breathing softened into a drowsy rhythm. Jonas rocked once, awkwardly, as if unfamiliar with the motion, and then Daniel slept against his chest as though it were the safest place in the world. Ruth stood in the shadows, her lips parted with words she could not speak. There was something in the sight that hollowed her and filled her at the same time. A man who had been called wild and unfit, cradling her son with a tenderness her neighbors would never believe. But the town had eyes and tongues that wagged sharper than knives. When Ruth hitched the wagon to fetch supplies in Dawson Creek, she felt their gazes before she heard their words. Abigail Turner, broad-hipped and sharp-chinned, stood near the mercantile with 2 other women. "Poor Ruth," Abigail murmured, loud enough to carry. First her husband gone, now keeping company with that mountain stray. No wonder folks are whispering. Ruth's face flushed hot, though the air stung with frost. She kept her chin high as she entered the store, her steps steady though her insides twisted. She told herself the gossip meant nothing, that survival left no room for pride. Yet shame clung to her shoulders like a weight she could not shrug off. Inside, Marshall Boone tipped his hat with the gentleness of a man who'd seen too much grief in his years. "You doing all right, Mrs. Callahan?" She forced a smile. "We're getting by." He studied her, eyes kind but heavy with things unspoken. Everyone seemed to be waiting, expecting her to fail. To stumble under the weight of widowhood and a baby, to confirm what they already believed, that she could not endure. Outside, Jonas waited by the wagon, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon rather than the townsfolk. Ruth noticed the way people avoided meeting his gaze, as if his silence unsettled them. She wondered if he heard their words. If he cared. She did. More than she wished to admit. Night stretched long in the cabin. The fire would crackle low, shadows stretching along the walls, Daniel asleep in his crib. Sometimes Jonas lingered by the hearth, sharpening his knife or mending a strap. His presence filled the room without noise. Ruth found herself stealing glances, the rough curve of his jaw, the way his hands moved with patience, how he seemed at home in stillness. One evening, as the storm winds clawed at the shutters, Jonas spoke without lifting his eyes. "Once had someone waiting," he said. Ruth looked up from her sewing. She didn't make it through a winter like this. His words were flat, but beneath them lay a grief untouched by time. He said no more and Ruth did not press. But in that moment the space between them shifted. She understood then why he carried silence like armor. Loss had carved him deep, the same way it had carved her. Connection grew not in declarations but in gestures. When the bucket slipped from her hands at the well, Jonas caught it before it struck the stones. He did not speak, only returned it with the briefest meeting of eyes. When her shawl slipped as she rocked Daniel by the fire, Jonas wordlessly laid another log on the hearth, so the warmth might reach her shoulders. These were not grand acts, yet each left a mark, subtle as footprints in new snow. Still the gossip circled. She heard it carried in the air like smoke, how Ruth Callahan was reckless, how she had brought a man of the wilderness into her home. Even children whispered as she passed, echoing their mother's words. One afternoon, after hearing Abigail's sharp voice call her desperate, Ruth shut the cabin door behind her and pressed her back to it, chest heaving. Daniel fussed in his cradle. Her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. Jonas was outside splitting wood. She listened to the steady thud of his axe, the sound anchoring her in the storm of shame. For a fleeting moment she imagined asking him to leave, to quiet the gossip, to carry her burden alone again. But then she looked at her son, who slept easier in Jonas's arms than in her own some nights, and she could not bring herself to send him away. The storm arrived sudden and fierce. Snow drove sideways across the prairie, howling against the cabin walls until it seemed the whole world might split apart. Ruth wrapped Daniel tight in blankets, whispering lullabies through the rattle of the shutters. Jonas moved with calm purpose, bracing the door, feeding the fire until the flames leapt tall and hot. When the baby whimpered, Jonas stepped close, holding out his arms without asking. Ruth hesitated only a breath before placing Daniel against his chest. She watched as Jonas rocked him, the child's cries softening until sleep claimed him. The man's face, rough-hewn by weather and solitude, bent with an expression almost tender enough to ache. For the first time, Ruth saw not the stranger the town feared, but a man carrying more than his share of burdens, choosing to carry hers as well. And in that storm-lit night, she realized something the town could never understand. Jonas McGraw was more than just a hired hand. The storm passed, leaving the world heavy with silence. Snow lay deep against the fences, glittering under the pale sun. Ruth stepped outside with Daniel in her arms and looked at the land stretched wide and unforgiving. She had survived another night, but survival was not the same as peace. Jonas worked steadily, his axe rising and falling with a rhythm that steadied her even as it reminded her of the endless demands. The barn sagged under the weight of snow, the roof bowed like an old man's spine. Repairs loomed, debts pressed, and the town's whispers grew louder each time she ventured into Dawson Creek. Marshall Boone found her outside the mercantile one morning. He tipped his hat, his expression lined with the weary kindness of a man who'd buried too many neighbors. "Mrs. Callahan," he said, voice gentle, "you know the bank's pressing. If the next payment isn't made, they'll take the land. Nothing personal, just law." Ruth swallowed hard. The earth under her boots felt less like soil and more like quicksand. She nodded, thanked him and moved on, though her chest ached with dread. Abigail Turner stood nearby, arms folded, lips tight with a smile that was not a smile at all. Land won't do her much good anyhow, keeping that wild man under her roof. Folks are beginning to talk. The words struck like stones, but Ruth kept walking. Still, the shame followed her home, whispering in her ears even as Daniel babbled innocently in her arms. The town's judgment sharpened like knives after that day. When Ruth passed the blacksmith's, men stopped talking mid-sentence, eyes sliding toward her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. Children repeated their mother's gossip in sing-song voices. "Widow keeps the mountains stray," one boy taunted when Ruth drove past with her wagon. Her face burned, but she sat tall, refusing to give them the satisfaction of bowed shoulders. Yet inside, the humiliation spread until it felt like a fire she could not smother. Jonas seemed unmoved by it all. He went about his work with the same quiet precision, hauling wood, mending fences, caring for the animals. But Ruth knew he heard. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, in the way his eyes lingered on the mountains as though they were calling him back. The breaking point came in town, when two ranch hands staggered drunk from the saloon and spotted Ruth outside the general store. "Well now," one of them sneered, "if it ain't the widow with her wild dog. Tell me, does he sleep inside or out?" The men laughed, their words rank with whiskey and cruelty. Before Ruth could respond, Jonas was there, stepping from the shadows. His presence was quiet but heavy, like thunder before the strike. "That's enough," he said. The ranch hands shifted, laughter faltering at the sight of him. Jonas didn't raise his voice or move toward them, Yet the air thickened with something dangerous. The men muttered curses and slunk away, but the damage was done. The townsfolk who witnessed it shook their heads, whispers curling in the air. She lets him fight her battles. She's not fit to be called decent. Ruth felt their judgment as keenly as the winter wind. That night, when Jonas returned to the cabin, she could hardly look at him. Daniel was asleep in his crib when Ruth finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, brittle. "You should leave, Jonas." Jonas looked up from where he sat by the fire, sharpening his knife. His eyes met hers, unreadable, steady. "The town will never stop talking," she continued, her throat tight. "Every kindness you show me only makes it worse. I can't live under their eyes like this." Silence stretched. Jonas sheathed his knife, stood, and pulled on his coat. He did not argue, did not plead. He gathered his few belongings with the same calm purpose he brought to every task. When he stepped to the crib, Daniel stirred, small hands reaching upward. A cry broke from the baby's lips as Jonas leaned close, brushing a rough hand over the child's hair. Then, without a word, he was gone into the night. Ruth stood in the doorway, watching his figure vanish into the white trees. Her heart twisted as Daniel wailed, his cries sharp in the quiet cabin. She pressed her hands to her face, her chest shuddering. She had sent away the only man who had stood steady beside her since the earth swallowed her husband. And yet she could not call him back. The next days blurred into gray. Ruth worked until her hands split, until her body trembled from exhaustion. Snow pressed heavy on the barn roof. The animals grew restless, water freezing before it reached their troughs. Then Daniel fell ill. It began with a cough, small at first, then sharper, fever heating his small body. Ruth pressed wet cloths to his forehead, whispered prayers until her voice cracked, but nothing soothed him. The walls of the cabin seemed to close around her, suffocating with the weight of her helplessness. One night, as the storm rose again and the wind screamed at the shutters, she held Daniel against her chest and rocked until her arms ached. His skin burned, his breath came ragged. Tears streaked her face as she whispered, "Please God, don't take him. Not him." She thought of Jonas then, the way he had held Daniel as if the boy's life was his own, the way silence seemed to soften around him. And guilt pierced her. She had sent away only man who might have known what to do. But the mountains keep their secrets, and sometimes they return what is needed most. Near midnight, when the storm's howl had nearly broken her spirit, Ruth heard the crunch of boots outside the door. She froze, clutching Daniel tight. The latch lifted, the door swung open, and snow swirled in around a tall figure dusted white with frost. "Jonas." He stepped inside with an armload of wood, satchel of herbs, and face lined with determination. He said nothing at first, only moved quickly, feeding the fire, boiling water, crushing leaves into a bitter-smelling tea. His hands, rough and steady, guided Ruth as though he had prepared for this moment. When she faltered, he caught her wrist gently. "He'll be all right," Jonas murmured, his voice low, sure. "We'll see him through." Through the long night, Jonas tended the child, cooling his fever, rocking him when Ruth's arms grew weak. Ruth sat close, her heart breaking and mending at once. She realized then that his leaving had not been abandonment. It had been her pride, her fear of judgment, that had driven him away. And still he had come back. Dawn broke slow and golden, light spilling across the snow like mercy itself. Daniel's fever eased, his breath soft and even. Ruth pressed her lips to his forehead and felt the coolness that told her the worst had passed. She looked up at Jonas. He was seated by the fire, Daniel cradled in his arms, his eyes heavy with weariness yet soft with something she had not seen before, a quiet peace. Ruth reached across the small space between them, her hand finding his. The touch was tentative, lingering, more powerful than any words. Jonas did not pull away. For the first time since her husband's death, Ruth felt the heavy cloak of loneliness slip from her shoulders. The gossip did not vanish overnight. Abigail Turner still whispered, and townsfolk still cast their glances. But Ruth no longer bent under their judgment. She walked into Dawson Creek with her head high, Daniel in her arms, and Jonas beside her not as a hired hand, but as something more. No one dared taunt her after that. Not when Jonas's quiet presence shadowed her steps, not when the strength of his loyalty spoke louder than any rumor. Life did not grow easy, but it grew steady. Roofs mended, fences held, and the winter days stretched into a spring that promised new beginnings. One evening, when the prairie glowed under a rose-colored dusk, Ruth stood at the doorway of her cabin and watched Jonas lift Daniel into the air. The child's laughter rang clear, brighter than birdsong. Jonas's face, so often stern, bent into a smile that softened the scars of his solitude. Ruth felt her heart swell, not with sudden passion but with something deeper, a quiet knowing, a trust built slow and sure. The kind of bond that endures because it has been tested. She whispered to herself almost as a prayer, more than a hired hand,